Hi, I'm Greg, and I started the first Fantasy NASCAR league without the internet.
So, Greg, we had a wonderful conversation over breakfast at a diner. I was actually meeting you through LinkedIn, and we connected and thought we'd meet for breakfast. And then I asked, "So, what's your story?" And then you dropped this bomb on me.
I know it's a little different.
Yeah. So, take me back to. So, a couple things that's really interesting is one, the first sentence of being the first NASCAR fantasy league, and then doing it pre-internet, which is insane to me. Take me back to the time period. What triggered this idea? Walk me through that.
Well, fantasy leagues started right near the end of the 1980s.
Okay.
And the company that really started it was USA Today. And they would do it for baseball, and they'd also do it for football. And they also started doing it for basketball, too.
Okay.
And what they would do is they would literally post the values of the teams or players, if you will. And what they would do is they'd assign a dollar value to each one, and then they would force you to select so many, like with football, so many quarterbacks, so many running backs, etc. And you had to stay within your salary cap. Well, I played these leagues, and this was before the internet. So it was all done either through the mail, or else you would pick up a phone, you'd call an 800 number and talk to somebody live, and you would make trades every week. Every week they would actually literally give you in their USA Today's Wednesday edition what the new values were for the players. And then you could make your trades based on that. Well, anyway, long story short, I played those games in those different sports. And I remember in 1993, my father-in-law is a huge NASCAR fan. And I thought, he lived in Reading, and I'm from York, Pennsylvania. And I basically thought I'll go and I'll, kind of bond with him a little bit, have a couple beers, and I'll watch the Daytona 500 with him. Well,
Sure.
just before the race, he said to me, I don't know much about these fantasy leagues I hear you talking about from time to time, but I know one thing: NASCAR is big. And why couldn't you do something like that with NASCAR? And I thought,
Bling,
boy,
bling, bling.
oh my God, yeah, light bulb went on top of my head. And I thought, you know what, he's right. This is huge. And this is when NASCAR was really exploding.
Okay.
Timing's everything.
So who was really big in that time period, just to give
Well, back in
context?
those days, you had Dale Earnhardt Sr., you had Jeff Gordon was really getting hot. It was the early days of his career, but he was one of the main challengers. You had Mark Martin, Rusty Wallace, Darrell Waltrip. You had a lot of classic guys, if you will.
Okay, so I want to ask another thing. So I'm
Yeah.
not a fantasy. I've actually never played in a fantasy league of any kind.
Okay.
But when I hear people talk about it, especially in today's age, they talk about the amount of time it takes to do these leagues. So,
Yeah.
question one: do you still play fantasy? Anything?
Yeah, I still do fantasy football.
Okay, so
Don't really do any of the others just because, like you said, it is a time commitment. But I do football. Football is kind of like one of those once a week type things that you can do.
okay,
You don't have to keep up with it every single day, if you will. Although it's getting more and more like that.
prior to the internet, what was I feel like you would take more time to keep up with your team than it would in today's age where you're just pulling up an app and swapping players out.
Yeah, I think it did. It did require more time because you had to basically, look at your piece of paper that had all the different driver values, and then you had to kind of mix and match and come up with what combination would work for you. So yeah, it did take more time.
And so they were always, you said, published in the USA Today. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
yeah.
I mean, what a niche market to make sure everybody's buying this every week.
Yeah, well, that's what they did in the other sports. Now, mine didn't work that way because
Okay.
mine, the way we did it is we would send you values literally in the mail. Now, we didn't do it every week. We did every other week.
Okay.
So it was based on a 2 week period. Usually there's two races because there's a race every week. So based upon those two races, the drivers' values would go up or down. And then just like a stock market, you would want to buy drivers when they were at a low value, sell them off when they were at you thought was their high peak value, and then pick up somebody else that you thought you could ride to an even higher value. So we started out, what we would do, we'd start with this $10 million budget, and
Okay.
we'd give you all the drivers at the beginning. And they'd range anywhere from a low of 300,000 all the way up to let's say 2.5 million, and you had 10 million to spend, but you only had to take 8 drivers, no more, no less. So you couldn't just say, I'll take all the top 8 drivers. You had to kind of mix and match. I'll take this top driver. I'll take one of these middle of the road guys. I'll take a couple of these lower drivers. So you had to kind of really strategize your team and who you're going to take. And that's what made it really strategy involved, is that it was almost like a stock market. So every 2 weeks when your values came out, now all of a sudden you would be like, oh, okay, now my team is worth, let's say that $10 million is now worth $10,800,000. So when I make my trades, my cap is now 10.8. It's not 10 million. So if you did a really good job of buying low and selling high, by the end of the challenge, you might have like a $14 or $15 million budget, and you could have almost like an all-star team of drivers on your team.
So you took the blueprint of kind of what was out there already and then applied it to the NASCAR world.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's what we did. And the scoring system was pretty simple. At that time, they had something called a Winston Cup scoring system. And that scoring system is the exact system we use. So if a driver won a race, he got X amount of points. That's what you got for your driver for that race. And you'd also get bonus points for leading the most laps, etc. So it was just like the Winston Cup scoring system.
So from an entrepreneurial setup, like how many employees did you have from the start? Like what did that look like?
Well, initially we started out with about, I would say 15 people as operators. And we had an 800 number coming in on a T1, and the people would call the 800 number and they would make their trades right there over the phone with a live operator. So, and then the live operators had computers in front of them, and they were literally entering those trades into the computer.
Okay. What was your capital to get this thing kicked off? Like, what did that look like?
Well, that was the beauty of all of this. It really was not that expensive.
Okay.
You're going to laugh, because initially, because we didn't have it on the internet, we were able to basically do it with, laptops, if you will. And so you were able to, we had a program based on an old software program called WYSIWYG at that time. And so that's what we used to load everybody's individual sheets up with their drivers. And so the first year, there were 601 people that played this first challenge. And so we had an algorithm that went in then and would, capture everybody's all 601 spreadsheets, if you will, and then be able to print out the results of, who won, who was second, third, et cetera. And it took a while to do all it. I mean, it took literally like sometimes 6 to 8 hours for the computer to be able to spit all that out.
Okay, so you were hanging out with your father-in-law. It was the first race of the season, correct?
Yes.
When he stated, right? So
Correct.
What was the time period from you going Eureka to marketing to getting 601 people in the first season?
Yeah, well, that was in '93, and that was the Daytona 500 that year. Obviously, the season had started. So we could either wait till '94, or we could say, you know what? Why don't we pick a midway point in '93? And that's what we did. The midway point was the Pepsi 400. And so we picked that as our race. And literally, we started advertising, I would say, about a month into the season for the second half of the year. And the place that we went to were things like Winston Cup Scene, Winston Cup Illustrated, all those magazines that were related to NASCAR racing, if you will. And the cost to get started wasn't much, because we already had our individual computers. So I would say that, it was certainly under $10,000 to be able to get all this started. And that included the advertising, because advertising was not that expensive back in the early 90s.
Okay, wow.
The beauty of it too was that we had, you could kind of rob Peter to pay Paul. And what I mean by that is, like, you'd advertise in one of the magazines, and by the time that the next month rolled around to advertise, you had generated enough revenue that you could pay for that next round of advertising. So it was pretty interesting.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so did you have I'm assuming you had a space for this 15 people, so you could have a phone where you could collect the data, and what did that look like?
Yeah, it was actually at my father-in-law's garage in Reading. He had a second
A
floor,
true
and the
startup.
second floor, yeah, believe it or not, it was in his garage because that's what he was. He owned his own garage. But we were up on the second floor, specifically just taking phone calls just upstairs there for everybody that had to play Fantasy Cup auto racing.
Did you have any expectation for the first season? Like, were you surprised at the 601?
I really had no idea what to expect. And at first, when I did it, I thought, I'll just kind of do this part time. I'll keep my daytime job. I was an accountant by trade. And I'll keep my daytime job and I'll just kind of do this on the side. And during the day, I had, I think it was two different girls that were manning the 800 number and taking down requests for rule books. And then we would send people their rule books so that they could join. Well, at nighttime, 5 o'clock rolls around and I get off work. We switched the phone lines over to my house. And there I am all throughout the night. Every time the phone rings, I'm jumping up and I'm answering the phone and writing it down so that the next day we can send this person a rule book. So I soon found out I couldn't do both my daytime job and do this and do both justice. And so my wife and I basically just came up with the decision that, you know what, let's go after this. Let's do this. And luckily she had a good enough job that we could afford to live off her salary for a while this thing really ramped up and got going.
So, what did you charge the 601 people that first season? Do you remember?
Okay, first, initially it was a $99.95 fee, or $100, if you will, for half a season.
Okay.
And we did that half a season thing all year long after the first season. So we always broke it into two halves. We called it the spring challenge and the fall challenge. And we would give people breaks, like instead of paying $100 twice, if you wanted to sign up for both at the beginning of the year, you could do it for like $169.95. We'd give you a discount.
So it was your first half season had the 60.
Year was 601. Second year we doubled. We were 1254. Third year, which was 95, we went over 2500. And every year it seemed like we kept doubling. In fact, I sold the business in 98 and I continued to run it for somebody for about 5 years afterwards. But by the time I sold it, there were about 15,000 people paying $100 twice a year to play.
So in 5 years, you got it up to 15,000 people playing.
Yeah.
Roughly, right? You said 93 to 98?
Yeah.
Holy smokes.
Yeah. Well, and we got to the point too where we were literally we kept raising the prize money. We got to the point where we were giving out over $100,000 a year in prize money. It was crazy.
Get out of here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially back then. That's a big deal.
I know.
Wow.
I know. It was phenomenal. It was almost like lightning in a bottle. And sometimes you're better to be lucky than good. I mean, we hit NASCAR just at the time when it was rising in popularity. It was going through the roof. And we rode that wave. We were really, really fortunate when it was all said and done.
So in the peak of that, when you're at, before you actually sold, when you're at your 15,000 peak, how big was the business then? Did you have around roughly the same people or did you have to increase?
We had more people. Like, for example, by the time I had sold, and I'll preface this too by saying that most of the business came in pockets. That last week before the start of a challenge, like 90% of the signups came in. So the weekend of Daytona, for example, we would have 30 live operators in there. And they would be taking all the phone calls. As soon as they took one and put the phone down, another one would be coming in. The interesting thing about it was that at that point in 98, we had already launched the internet game of Fantasy Cup auto racing as well. So you were now allowed to be able to play online, or you could still do it over the phone, with a live operator. And even those people that played online, they loved talking to a live operator. So they would still call in and make their changes, even though they were playing online, because they like to talk to somebody.
Sure. So was the online benefit more, instead of having to look up the paper version of how like the biweekly results or values, is that what they were using the online version for?
Yes. That's why it was funny. A lot of people got a computer back in those days because of that. And they got online access so that they could play our game. And then they could go online and they'd be able to see the values there. It was wild. It really was. And you know what? We never really lost the mailings as well. Even though we went online with an internet, we still continued to send mailings to everybody every 2 weeks as well. So they still got a mailing, even though might have been playing online.
That's so crazy. You were in like this perfect bubble, like this storm, like all these things were just combining all at one time for this perfect hurricane.
Oh, it was crazy. Yeah, it
Wow.
was crazy. And we like I said, sometimes timing is everything. We just happened to hit a sport that nobody else was doing. And we launched some other sports too. Now, they didn't get as big as what NASCAR did, but we were still the first to do them and we were successful with them. Like we were the first ones to do fantasy college football. We
Okay.
did a fantasy NCAA tournament where you were able to make trades throughout the tournament and you would score points based upon if your team was a 16 seed and they won their game, you get so many points for the win, but then you'd also get 16 points for picking that upset, if you will. So it was wild. We did fantasy golf, we did fantasy surfing. So I mean, it was pretty wild.
Wow. Okay. Literally riding the wave. So,
Yeah,
do you remember?
there's a surfing circuit, and yeah, we actually did some fantasy surfing too.
Do you remember a specific day that would have been the worst in that time period? Where did you ever have anything where like the phones went down, or a specific day that was
Ooh,
awful?
yeah, yeah. We had a situation like that where the phones were going ballistic on the day of the Daytona 500 that morning, and the phones went down for about an hour. And we're thinking, oh my gosh, all of our revenue is just literally going right out the window because that's when everybody was signing up. Now, luckily, they got up within an hour, and when they did, when the smoke cleared, everybody, I guess, that had tried to call during that 1 hour window ended up still getting in. And a lot of it probably was because at least the internet stayed up so that if they couldn't call in and get the live operator, they could still go online and do it themselves.
So you also let me know a story when we were sitting together about one of the most stressful things during this time period was when it snowed in Pennsylvania. Why is that?
Yeah. Well, Daytona 500, think about it, it's always in February. February in the Northeast is not exactly a great time. So we had some times where there were some snowstorms and you can imagine our operators, a lot of them, were young men and women who didn't feel comfortable driving in the snow. So I had a Dodge Durango. And
Yeah.
I can remember driving around to everybody's house, picking people up, trying to get them in there so that they could man the phones and be able to take down the signups. It was crazy.
That's really wild. What was a day that you remember that was absolutely so much fun? Is there anything that jumps out that was like that was a really good day of this whole ride?
I think one of my favorite days was we had a spokesperson for fantasy auto racing, and it was Ned Jarrett. And
Okay.
Ned is one of the top 50 drivers of all time in NASCAR racing. Obviously, his son Dale drove as well. But I remember going to Martinsville I believe it was before the 95 season. Yeah. And I remember meeting him, and I had talked to him on the phone several times prior. And this was my first opportunity to meet him. And I had a contract there for him to sign to be the fantasy spokesperson for Fantasy Cup Auto Racing. And we were in Martinsville, Virginia. And when he signed it, I just remember I was like flying. I was flying off the ground because I thought, oh my God, this is the beginning of when this thing's going to really erupt. And it did. And the reason it did is because Ned at that time had a program called Inside Winston Cup Racing on TNT. And it was a weekly television show, magazine based on racing. And he would have me on a couple weeks before the start of each challenge to be able to talk about the fantasy league. They'd throw up the 800 number, throw up the web address, and things just went ballistic whenever people would see that. And that's where things really took off. And I think I credit Ned a lot for us getting to 15,000 people. I don't think we would have gotten there without him.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah, you went through like the full gamut of like It's so interesting because I think I'm such an opposite of an entrepreneur, and hearing this story, like was there ever a moment where you're like, this is such a waste of time, or did it just happen so fast you didn't have time to breathe?
Well, it happened pretty quickly, but that first year was pretty stressful. I mean, quitting my
Okay.
job and
Mm.
doing this full time and relying strictly off my wife's salary. Thank God for my wife; she's a saint. She supported this the whole way, and I was so fortunate. I really was, and I thank God every day that I was as lucky as what I was.
Do you believe the saying that, you really find out or you really will push yourself farther if you don't have a backup plan like you did? You went after it, you quit your job. Do you think you still would have made it with a backup?
I don't know. One of the things that drove me as well is that I had a 2-year-old son and an infant daughter at the time, so
Mm.
you had to provide for them, and it's not like we had a lot of money that we had a lot of reserve to fall back on. So yeah, you work your butt off and do the best that you can, and you can't accept no. You just can't. And you got to believe, and you got to just keep doing it.
What did
Oh,
your
he thought it was
father-in-law
cool
think?
too. He thought it was really cool. He really did. He was extremely supportive through this whole thing. He was the one that provided the first year there. He provided the place for us to operate out of there, out of his garage. Now the second year, we had done well enough the first year that I said, you know what, we're going to find a place that's going to be close to our home because Reading's literally about close to an hour away from York. So
Yeah.
it was such a commute for me. It was crazy. So it was so nice then to be able to find something in York that was a 10-15 minute commute the second year. So we no longer needed his garage after that point. But I'm so thankful that he was kind enough to be able to give us a head start.
Well, good thing you did because you were on snow patrol duty, right? Running around.
So true. So true. Yeah, trying to do that. Thank God we didn't have that the first year. And I was fortunate enough because the first year, like I said, we started at mid-year, so we were talking about July for the start of it. So
Okay.
didn't have to worry about snow at that point.
And so for somebody who wants to, take a leap of faith into something they've never done before, what are some pieces of advice, from this? Well, you did multiple of these, then you also did some other entrepreneurial stuff afterwards. Like what are three keys that you see in to have in your bag when you're starting something brand new?
Well, the big thing is you have to believe. That's the biggest thing.
Mm.
If you don't believe, nobody else is going to believe, and it's not going to work. The second thing is, I think you need to sit down and you need to figure out, financially, how much is this going to cost, and is it viable? And in my instance, it was kind of a service industry. It wasn't a product. It was kind of a service. So yeah, that was a lot cheaper than if you were manufacturing a product. And that's one of the reasons why I was able to get it up for such a cheap price. So, but financially, you need to figure out, what's this going to cost? What's it going to take? And then the third thing is, I mean, you have to have faith. You do. You absolutely, positively have to have faith. You have to trust that that this is the right path, and you have to get down that path.
Did all or any of those original 15 ride with you all the way till 98?
Let me think. Yes, there were some who did. Yes, there were a couple. One in particular I can think of is a guy that was hired the first year, and he went from being an operator. His name was Jim Rebholz, and he lived in Reading. And he actually, even when we moved to York, he would commute from Reading to York because he liked it so much. And we ended up making him one of our supervisors in charge of the operators. So he worked out great, and he was a godsend.
So at that peak of when you had your most employees, like what did that org structure look like, and kind of what were some of the positions? Like what was the overall view of the company?
Well, my wife Robin and I ended up obviously running the company from the top down, but we had a right hand man who basically oversaw all of the employees, if you will. And he also was in charge of making sure that we had the right equipment for the internet, right phone lines, everything. And then we had an individual who also was a programmer that basically did all of our programming as well. And then we had eventually ended up with a controller. And then we had probably, let's see, 3 supervisors and then all the operators.
Hmm. Were the operators on 24 hours a day, or is that during a time frame?
We didn't do that. What we ended up doing was that once we got going, we started having normal regular hours where we would do like a 9 to 5 thing, except for on the weekend of a race. And then at that point, we would actually run until about 11 o'clock at night during
Okay.
the Friday nights and Saturday nights. And then Sunday, you'd go right up until the race. But Monday through Thursday, it was like a 9 to 5. And then if it was a race weekend, then that's when we had the long hours where you had the evening hours.
Did you ever get any recognition from NASCAR itself?
Oh, yeah. Well, we think about this. This is back in the days when fantasy leagues, today everybody takes it for granted that it's legal. But back in those days, there was kind of a thin line between people didn't quite know, was it gambling? Was it not gambling? So that's what you fought against all the time. And before I started the company, I went to at the company that I worked for. It was a pretty large company, and I went to their legal department, and I had talked to one of the lawyers there, and he said, "You know what? I know a lawyer that would be a great guy to talk to," and he sent me to this gentleman, and he did the research for me. He said, "Yep, it's legal," and the reason it's legal, he says, because there's a level of skill. And let me tell you this: here's the skill factor. The skill factor is exactly what I told you about, which is the stock market approach. Because if you do a good job of buying low, selling high, you end up increasing your value and you end up with all stars at the end. Now, if it was all luck, somebody who won one year, the next year they could easily be in the bottom 10%, but that never happened. The people that knew how to really work it, even though they may not have won, they would finish in the top 10% every year. So you always had a consistency of those people who really knew how to play the game. So now back to answer your question, we took the web address fantasynascar.com, and when NASCAR realized that we had it and they eventually wanted to do a fantasy game themselves, they sent cease and desist letters and stuff like that, but they had no leg to stand on because we had already acquired that particular web address, so it was ours. There wasn't anything they could do. They had no legal leg to stand on. And I had talked to a lot of people inside the NASCAR circles. We had talked to people at Winston Cup Scene, Winston Cup Illustrated. I talked to people like Don Hawk, who was Dale Earnhardt's agent, and everybody loved it. And everybody saw the dollar signs, but everybody was afraid to jump in because they just weren't sure whether or not it was legal.
So the line is that thin between gambling and being somewhat skilled. You got feedback from a professional and you said, you know what, screw it. We're going for it.
Yeah, that's basically what we did. And what I did was I said, I thought it has to be legal. And the reason it had to be is, why is USA Today doing it? If it wasn't legal, there is no way in the world, if their legal team didn't sign off on it, that they'd be doing this and risking the reputation of the newspaper and basically the reputation of the whole company. So I knew it had to be legal, but I just had to have somebody tell me why it was, and that's where the lawyer that I had gone to see was able to tell me such.
So outside of the NASCAR domain, did you ever have any instance where you had run in with any type of legal or law to say, hey, what are you doing? Is this legal? Look into it at all?
We didn't really run into any issues. You would have thought that we would have had all kinds of like letters from different states and so on and so forth. We really never did. Nobody really bothered us other than, the big boy NASCAR themselves.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah, you would have thought there would have been some people coming after us, but no, there really wasn't.
So you get to 98 and someone comes knocking because you're playing, you got 15,000 subscribers now that come every every 6 months, or however you guys did, if you split it up into 6 months, what did that look like, and what was that initial like contact?
Well, what ended up happening was that there was a company at that time called Action Performance Racing. And Action Performance Racing, they were huge. They're based out of Tempe, Arizona, and which is a suburb of Phoenix. And they basically they had the rights to virtually every top driver's uh, merchandise. So, in other words, every hat, every jacket, every diecast car, everything related to a
Wow.
particular driver, they would produce, and they'd be the ones that would control the merchandise. And they had all the top drivers signed up. They had your Earnhardts, they had your Rusty Wallaces, you know, they had your Tony Stewart, they had everybody. Everybody was locked up. And so they were just a huge player inside the NASCAR circles. Were the first company that was not afraid to basically say, hey, yeah, we do think this is legal. So they had, it was interesting because in 98, that's back when people at that time were uh, developing all these online sites, and then they
Hmm.
were spinning them off, going public, and
Sure.
raising all kinds of money. And it was incredible how many domains were doing this. And anyway, they had the idea that they were going to have this GoRacing.com. And GoRacing.com was kind of like the equivalent of what ESPN is, but just strictly for racing. And they had coast to coast, what do you want to say, coast to coast reporters all over for all forms of racing. And it was not just NASCAR. We're talking NHRA drag racing. We're talking the dirt track. We're talking IndyCar, Formula One, everything. And they wanted us to be the fantasy company to run leagues for all these different sports, which was great.
Wow.
So we fit
Yeah.
right into the wheelhouse. But the problem was within 6 weeks of when they acquired us, um, apparently when they went on their dog and pony show, it was when that bubble was starting to burst and people were no longer starting to invest in these .coms, and they didn't raise the capital that they needed to do, and they decided to pull the plug on the project. So here they had bought us specifically for this website that was no longer going to exist. And they're like, hey, you guys are a great little company. We love what you do. But unfortunately, we don't have a place for you now because we don't have this site. So we're going to keep you for a while, but we're going to look for somebody to sell you to. And they had us for about a year, and then they sold us off to a private equity company.
And you were still running it at that point, correct?
I was, yeah. I ran it for them, and then I ran it for the private equity company. I ran it until about 2003, and at the end of the 2003 season, that's when my contract ran out, and I didn't agree with the private equity company how they did things, because I thought that they looked at things as to how can we get money today rather than looking at the strength of the game tomorrow. For example,
Mm.
when I set the game up, it was you were allowed 3 trades a week, no more, no less. So everybody, it didn't matter how much money you had, um, everybody was on the same playing field. Well, they got the idea, hey, if people want to buy more than 3 trades, we'll just charge them additional money for trades, and they can get 5, 6 trades a week. Well, that's
So you can buy
great
your way to
for the
victory.
guy who has
Yeah.
the money. Yeah, but the guy who doesn't have that kind of cash to be able to lay it out every week, they started getting frustrated. Like, hey, this isn't the same playing surface. This guy's got twice as many trades as what I've got. It's not fair. So, and I told them that was what was going to happen, and they didn't want to hear it. And eventually, that was the demise of the game. It still exists today, but it's a fraction of what it was at one time, and it's a shame because it would have, I think, continued to skyrocket if they had just followed the course. But it is what it is. Everybody has different ideas.
Sure. So that 5 years when you were working essentially for someone else since they bought you out, and you just mentioned probably one of the scenarios. What were the main differences, in that where you just weren't? I'm assuming it's because you didn't get to call the shots. There was more red tape. Was that the major change?
It became more of a job than it did a hobby. When my wife and I had it, it was fun, and we really enjoyed every day, and it was great. Um, and there was not that pressure on us. But once we sold, there was constant pressure to get more revenue, get bigger, get bigger, get bigger, get bigger, and it constantly became more of a job, and it just wasn't as enjoyable as what it had been.
Mm. Yeah. I hear the story. You always hear the story about private equity. Private equities are being bought out, right? And then the people who were there always, it just, the culture changes or whatever that looks like. You usually hear the horror stories over the ones that go well. So I was curious of what it kind of looked like behind the curtain.
Yeah, it was kind of a
Hmm.
shame. But yeah, that was the idea. Everything was about earnings per share and being able to set up to be able to sell to somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah. That's sad, especially with what you saw in those first 5 years. And then, like you said, like if they would have just kept the formula the same, it could have just kept exploding.
As it was so
Did you?
successful, and it was frustrating too because I would hear people who had been in from day one, and we had a message board as well at that time, and people could put comments and stuff, and when they started going to, hey, you could buy trades, everybody still thought it was my company, and some people started calling me Greedy Greg, and it was kind of frustrating because it was like, yeah, I know it looks like it's me, but it's not me. Trust me, I didn't want that to happen. But you couldn't tell them that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't think I ever thought of that because so you were the face of the company for that long, for that time period.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. And we even had programs where, once we had some winners, we would have those winners get their picture taken. Could be with me, could be with Ned Jarrett. So, I mean, people didn't know me, and they felt like, they felt like they were friends with me. So it did hurt to hear some of the comments that came through afterward.
Do you think, how different do you think that would have played out if social media would have existed back then?
Oh boy, social media just happens so quickly.
Yeah, but you mentioned,
I'm sure people would have probably been even more brutal than what they were back then. I've seen some of the comments out there when it comes to sports and stuff, and some of the things people say. It's like, oh my god, happened. But I think it would have just been quicker. Let's put it that way.
Oh. Yeah. Okay. With the social media today, do you think, like during your peak of being the spokesperson, do you think you could have, I mean, you might have exploded if you had a social media presence when it was positive?
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. I think that would have helped because certainly I could have been on. I could have been in chat rooms. I think there would have been a way to connect to the people even more so than what we already had.
Yeah, you said with the message boards, but I'm even thinking like beyond that. Oh my gosh, that you could have had Discord channel, you could have had your own mini messaging boards or message center for the entire, I mean, it would have been crazy. Holy smokes. Did you fall in love with NASCAR then?
I did. I really liked it a lot. It was funny because I'd always been a baseball, basketball, football, hockey guy. I never was a huge racing guy until I really got into it. But I got to meet so many people inside that circle of the sport that I got into it and I really enjoyed it. And everybody in my family, we would always, we would watch the races and we'd have fun.
Do you feel fantasy leagues make the sport more enjoyable?
Oh, I do. I definitely do.
Okay.
Because I think that it's great to root for your team, but even when your team's not playing, if you have guys that are active on other teams, it's a reason to continue to watch the sport and to still get enjoyment out of it. So yeah, it enhances your enjoyment of the sport, no doubt.
Did you see fantasy overall getting as, because I mean it's massive. Did you see it getting as big as it is today?
Yeah, I always thought it could be this big. I was 30 years too early because we were doing the same things that your DraftKings are doing, and we were. And then timing, once again, timing's everything. And it's just a shame that it was 30 years earlier and not today because that could have been us. But hey, it is what it is.
Yeah, you could have been a bazillionaire because those people are just, I mean, the money that flows through fantasy leagues, I can't even fathom.
Oh yeah, and for so many years, the sports, football and basketball, and well, all the sports were basically like, no, and we're not getting involved. And now they're in full bore. It's unreal.
Yeah, yeah, and now gambling's legal.
Yeah, that's funny too. Yeah, what used to be taboo, now it's on TV being advertised all over the place. Yeah, it's incredible. It's funny how things change.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, once again, I think it just comes down to the money's going in the right places. So everybody's on board, I guess, or whatever you want to claim the
That's
right
exactly
places.
right. Yeah, and you hit the
Um,
nail on the head. It's not just a little bit of money. I mean, it's big money, and that's why they've all embraced it.
yeah, it's huge. So, just for general, I like to close out with general audience questions. So, like, who are your teams? Who's your favorite driver? Walk me through all your favorite sports and who do you like?
Okay. Well, it's pretty simple. I'm a huge Philadelphia sports fan. So I'm
Yeah.
Phillies, Flyers, Eagles, Sixers. There's only one team, professional team that I follow outside of those four, and you'll laugh, but it's the New Orleans Saints. And the reason I became a Saints fan, I'm 60 years old, actually 61 now. And when I first started following sports, football in particular, college football, Archie Manning was in his senior year at Ole Miss, and he was the Heisman Trophy candidate. And I loved Archie Manning, so when the Saints drafted him, I naturally became a Saint fan too. So he's the only one outside of, or they're the only team outside of Philly that I follow. As far as NASCAR drivers go, it's funny. Once we sold the business, it's almost like it was kind of it was kind of bittersweet because I kind of stepped away from NASCAR then, and I really don't follow it that heavily today. And I think it's just I don't know, that chapter of my life kind of closed, and so it's I don't know how to explain it, but it just did. It's kind of weird. So I really don't have a
Mm.
favorite driver. Back then, you'll laugh, but my favorite driver back then was probably Lake Speed, and Lake Speed was not a great driver by any stretch of the imagination. I guess I always rooted for underdogs. I don't know what the deal is.
Is this your go-to party trick? This story?
No, I really don't tell many people this story.
What?
I think most people have no idea. I don't ever bring it up unless somebody that I know happens to somehow make a comment, and then I'll elaborate on it. But for the most part, I really don't ever talk about it. You're one of the few people that I've talked to about it.
Oh, that's so crazy. I'm so glad you did. Do your kids understand what a huge deal that was that you pulled what you pulled off?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, I think they do, and I think they appreciate it. But it's interesting in life. Sometimes when you do really well with something, like we did with the fantasy racing, um, I probably should. I did so well with that. I should have just probably semi-retired. But I was still pretty young at that point in time because back in '98, I was only like 35, and my wife's like 32. So we kind of were at a point where it's like, well, we're too young to retire, so we got to do something else. And I was foolish because I jumped into something that I probably should have never gotten into. I got into ice cream franchises. I had 3 Maggie Moo's ice cream stores, and I had 2 in York and 1 in Harrisburg. And between the 3 stores, I felt like I had 50 teenage sons and daughters. And as well as the NASCAR did, that's how poorly the ice cream stores had done. And so sometimes you're better off to sit back and don't think that you can do anything just because you did one thing right. You need to be a little more uh, just take a step back and analyze things a little bit better. I should have taken my own advice from what I had told you earlier. I didn't do enough of that for the second one, and it kind of bit me. But hey, that kind of. I will say this though: I've learned more off the business that did poorly than I did off the one that did well. Because you start learning the things not to do, and I've been on that other side of the fence where payroll's coming around, and you're like, oh my gosh, am I going to make payroll this week? So it's really given
Mm.
me a lot of empathy for the person that is the small businessman.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think you mentioned about personnel, do you think that was the main difference between the success of one versus the other?
And I think what it was more than anything else was I just think one was a service industry, one was a product industry, and the product itself that we had, the ice cream, the margins were just so slim that you had to do incredible
Hmm.
volume. And the problem is, you could do that if you had something that was at a beach resort that year round had great weather, like down in Miami or something like that. But up here in the Northeast, obviously during the winter months, you're going to kind of starve, and so you do really well in the summer, and then you just starve in the winter. So it all kind of evened out.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, you've had quite the entrepreneurial journey. And just, I guess when you kick off your career with a banger, I guess like you said, you think you can take on the world, and that's what you jumped into.
You do. You feel like you're like Teflon, that no matter what you do, nothing's going to affect you. But yeah, and you learn pretty quickly when you have one that's not so good. That hey, maybe I'm not as smart as I thought I was.
So, what are three big takeaways from the Maggie Moves? Do you think that you could tell your
Oh my
younger self
God.
before you
So
get
the
into it?
first the first thing is think it through and make sure that it makes viable sense from a dollar and cents standpoint. I feel like that was a dog from the beginning. And I should have seen the warning signs. I should have known when they were franchised. And when you went to the franchisor, they could never really give you any financial information on any of the particular franchisees out there, because it was privileged information, supposedly. And I think it's because they knew that the margins were so bad that nobody'd want to do it otherwise. And that was and that's number two, is that hey, if somebody can't give you numbers to back something up, walk away. It's probably not good. Uh, I didn't learn that, and I should have learned it right up front, and I did, and I learned it the hard way. Uh, and
Hmm.
and what it did do is, though, I'm a commercial loan officer now for a bank, and what it did do for me, it's really given me a lot of what do you want to say, empathy for the small businessman, that I really want to help them. And if there's any way to
Hmm.
be able to do a loan, to be able to make their lives a little easier, I know what it was like being on that other end of the fence, and I'd like to be able to help. So it taught me that, at least. It taught me, to be
Hmm.
able to try to persevere and help others.
Yeah, that's really brilliant. Yeah, because when you walk that path, like you said, where is payroll going to come from this week? I'm sure that puts you in a headspace that you never forget. Hmm.
Oh,
That's
absolutely.
really good.
Absolutely. And you'll have sleepless nights, no doubt.
What was the best thing you bought with either what you sold the company for, or in your best year? What was one thing you bought that you were super proud of?
I think that probably what it was, I remember now, this happened at the end. It was not, we were pretty good with our money when we had fantasy sports. We bought a couple timeshares, and you're going to think, oh my God, timeshares. Well, the timeshares worked out well because we used them for prizes. For some of the people. So when I ended up
Brilliant.
selling the business, I ended up getting to keep the timeshares. So that was kind of nice. But I think the thing I'm most proud of is would have been right after we had gotten out of the business, but we had made our money, and I had got my wife a 2004 Nissan 350Z for her birthday. So that was probably the thing I was most.
Hey, what color?
And I still have that car today.
What
So,
color did you get? Out exterior.
we went with blue, with the it's kind of like a cream interior, but the it's a rag top, so you can take the top
Yeah.
down, and it's a fun car to drive. It's definitely a fun
Oh
car to drive. It's
man,
like riding on rails.
that's amazing. Good shout on that. They were huge back then. I'm
Yeah,
pretty
yeah. Well, my
sure.
wife had always had. My wife had always had one of the Datsun. What were they at that time? A 280Z or something like that. And so she had one of those when she was younger, and she liked it. And so I thought, oh, she'll love this because it just came out. And I thought, oh, she'll love the 350Z, and she did. So it worked out well.
Amazing. That's amazing. Well, Greg, this was fascinating. I was so excited to listen to this story again, and we even got definitely some more deep details. So I want to thank you for coming on and taking time and being a part of Just Some BS.
So, well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed going down memory lane as well, and I'd be happy to come back anytime.
Awesome. So some of the audience doesn't know, I actually interviewed your son just last week because he's an esports guy. So I got to talk video games and all things esports and open up my eyes to that whole world. So but your episodes will be back to back actually. So your son's episode will be right before yours. So it'll be some son and father time on the Justin BS podcast.
That's excellent. I appreciate that. I'm definitely going to listen.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much. And we will, I'm sure I'll be meeting with you for breakfast sometime soon in the future.
Sounds good, Brandon. Thank you for having me.